Hi guys, and welcome to the No Gluten Zone. I create content for people with food issues, and that is normally anything from food allergies to food intolerances to food sensitivities to autoimmune issues that affect your diet. Today, I'm going to be a little more specific with celiac disease. Celiac disease very often kind of stands alone in its own category, but it is an autoimmune disease and it is genetic. So today I want to speak to those who are newly diagnosed. You're overwhelmed, you're processing a lot of information. You're like, what do I do with this? Where do I go from here? How do I start on this journey? A few people are lucky to have really well-informed doctors, and they get really good information from their doctor and or a dietitian. So that's my first tip, is if you can see a dietitian, I highly recommend it. Some are better than others, so it may not go great, but at least take that chance if you have that chance and get what you can from it. So let me start with the basics. Gluten, it naturally is present in wheat, rye, and barley. Now, oats is a whole nother ball game where oats don't actually contain gluten, but they are very often cross-contaminated. They're grown in the same fields, they're processed with the same equipment. So my advice, oats are very touchy, and it comes down to individual people, and finding oats that are truly not cross-contaminated is very challenging these days. Even some that say they are gluten-free are really not to the legal limits of it. So my biggest advice if you're first starting out is no oats and don't eat out. Start there until you have a firm grasp on all of this and give yourself time. I have to say, the first 2 years, I was diagnosed, and then right after my son was diagnosed, and we were on this journey together. And the first 2 years, I think, I would say, are full of just mistakes, learning mistakes. You learn from them and you do better. But give yourself grace and be patient with yourself as you go through this. So the next thing is to understand labels. I'm in the USA. Unfortunately, I don't feel that our label laws are honest enough or accurate enough or forthcoming enough. There are some products that will say, may contain, or on shared equipment or in a shared facility with such and such possible allergens. Those are voluntary disclaimers. I appreciate them, but just because it doesn't say that doesn't mean that's not there. If you really want to dig, if there's one particular item that you really like and you really want to know, do some research, contact the company, and ask the specific questions that you need to know if it's safe or not. That would be my recommendation for you. Having said all that, something to understand is how things can get gluten in them. And typically, the less processed or even just touched an item is, the more chances it has of getting contaminated with gluten. So if something is smoked or aged or, cooked or seasoned in some way, there's more chances there than if you just bought, meat in a package or produce. Those things are less likely, and you can also come home and wash them first, which I think you should. So look at that. The more fresh whole foods you buy and cook, the less your chances are of them having gluten. Now, a lot of things can say gluten-free on the label, and people argue back and forth all the time that, they can't legally say that unless they're checking it. I know there are laws in place, but it comes down to who's enforcing those laws, who's actually checking. If you look, some companies are very honest about their process, and they will tell you, they check once a year, or they check, every so many batches. And to me, that's not very reliable. A lot can happen in between when things are on, shared equipment and that sort of thing. So that's comes down to being a personal choice for you, really. But early on, the less mistakes you make, the better, when you're first letting your body heal and getting through this and learning how to do this. Always question sauces, spices, condiments. The more plain something is, the less chances it has also of having gluten. However, it could be cooked on a surface that just had gluten cooking on it, and then it's not safe. So that's not a guarantee, but it's just something to pay attention to and think about. And when you're shopping for food, you will see on labels, when it can say gluten-free, and then sometimes there's like a seal, a special, certification of being gluten-free. There are different certification companies. I'm not up to date on all of them, but if you look them up, you can usually find on their website, the certification company's website, not the food website, but on the certification company's website, they should tell you, how they test and what their standards are. Some brands also, dedicated gluten-free brands, test to a different level of gluten. So the legal limit just across the board is 20 parts per million. Anything saying it's gluten-free should be less than 20 parts per million of gluten in the product. Unfortunately, I can tell you that is not a guaranteed truth in the USA. I can't speak for other countries, so you have to be very careful. And I'm not up to date on a lot of the current certification companies. The one that I recognize the most and I trust the most is certified gluten-free, and its symbol looks like this. I will also add, though, that's not a guarantee. I have seen things that are on shared equipment that are certified with that, and it has still been too high of a level, and I've gotten sick, and I know other people too. There are recalls all the time, whether you hear about them or not, where things were caught and that they were way over the limit. So it does happen. That is the most trustworthy gluten-free certification that, in my experience, is the most safe. When I see that, I feel safe. Doesn't mean it's guaranteed, but the odds are very good in your favor. So going back to, how do you navigate this? This is all new to you, and you're like, where do I go from here? How do I do this? One of the things is plan your meals. Don't wait until you're hungry and then you're like, what am I going to eat? You can plan, one day at a time. You can plan a week at a time, whatever works for you. But plan out, maybe sit down and even just plan out, here's some breakfast ideas, here's some lunch ideas, here's dinner ideas, here's snack ideas, dessert ideas. One thing that helped me the most when I was really struggling at first was to sit down and think about what I would normally be eating, and then try to find a replacement for that thing that I can't have now, something that would replace it in a satisfactory way. It might be the same temperature, it might be the same texture. Just, you need to find something to replace that. Look at how you eat and find out what your needs are, and make sure those needs are being met. For me, I need to have at least one hot meal a day. My other meals everything can be cold. I usually start my day with a cold protein shake, and lunch can be, a cold sandwich or salad or something like that. But then I want my dinner to be a hot meal, or I can have lunch as a hot meal, and then dinner can be a salad, sandwich, something more simple and not necessarily a hot meal. So those are things to really evaluate in yourself and make sure that you're meeting those needs that you have, and looking at, what can I replace? If you want this sandwich, what can you replace it with that will give you that same satisfaction? And sometimes what you're going to start out with isn't what you're going to stick with for the long run. Just, you need to get going and get started right here, right now. Many times when we first start out, we're buying a lot of packaged things. They're certified gluten-free, it's safe, and we eat a lot of processed. And maybe some people are eating processed stuff already, so they're transitioning over to processed stuff. But I will say that gluten-free grains, if you're eating, products, crackers, cookies, breads, gluten-free products like that, they're not quite the same. Wheat just is a more well-rounded grain. It's got, fiber, and it's got, more protein and stuff. Whereas the gluten-free grains, there is no one gluten-free grain that can just replace wheat across the board. So what they do is they take grains and they also mix in starches, and they come up with this equivalent that will act like wheat in baking. But they are a lot more starchy. And so some people struggle then with constipation because there's not enough fiber and there's too much starch, and it can get complicated for certain people. Just something to be aware of and be cautious with, because I see so many people asking, like, what is going on? Why is this happening to me? So just hang in there. Another concern is sometimes people lose weight. Sometimes people gain weight. Initially, I did lose a lot of weight, and I was eating, cake, and cookies, and all this stuff gluten-free, but I was still losing weight. But eventually, as your body heals, that switches, and then you start. So don't panic either way. In the beginning, don't worry about your weight. Just worry about letting your body heal and getting the nutrition it actually needs, and moving forward from there. But ultimately, I recommend, moving away as you get going and get the hang of it. Move away from the processed packaged products and make sure you are getting some just real whole foods, produce and meat, and grains if you do eat grains, just so your body is healthier as you go through this. I also want to mention cross-contamination. This is something my doctor did not even mention. I did not even know this was a thing, and I had to learn the hard way. So I like to share this information and make sure it is known. I think there's a lot of people talking about it online now. I was diagnosed like 12 years ago, I think, and it wasn't as much online as there is now. But just in case you are not aware, cross-contamination is a real thing. It's not always an issue for the gluten intolerant or non-celiac gluten sensitivity people. For some of them it is, but it's not always. But for celiac, it is a real issue. Even the tiniest little speck or crumb in your food can damage your small intestine and cause problems. And every time your small intestine gets damaged, it can take around 6 months to heal that. So if you are, constantly getting this little speck, your intestine will never fully heal, and then you cannot absorb nutrition like you need to and should. So it is very important to pay attention to this and get your body the healing and nutrition that it needs. One misunderstanding I see some people have is something says it's gluten-free, so they think it's gluten-free, but it doesn't just automatically stay gluten-free. It's almost like, if you have any knowledge of working in a sterile field. I'm a nurse. I know how to work in a sterile field. And your sterile field, it doesn't just automatically stay sterile. You have to keep it sterile. Any germ or any contaminant can come into your sterile field, and it's no longer sterile. And I have applied this to being gluten-free since the very beginning. So your gluten-free item is not going to just automatically stay gluten-free. If someone is lifting something with gluten across your plate, crumbs can fall in, even tiny, tiny crumbs, and now you're contaminated. If your gluten-free food touches any surface that was touching gluten, it is now contaminated. So people frequently talk about shared equipment. There is equipment in where they process food, manufacture food facilities. There is equipment that food is on, and sometimes there is products containing wheat on that same equipment, and then your food that should be gluten-free comes along on there. It is now contaminated. This is more common with things that are just kind of naturally gluten-free, beans, rice, maybe oats, things along those lines. A lot of like freeze-dried foods, dehydrated foods, those freeze dryers and dehydrators, they put all kinds of stuff in there. And so there's stuff in there with gluten. And then they put, so that's something that I've just learned over time. Those are very suspect for containing gluten. And a lot of them will slap a gluten-free label on there. And when I've checked it, whether it's with my NEMA sensor or my gluten detection dog or just my intestine before I had any of those things, they were not gluten-free. So in your own kitchen, as you're transitioning over, you want to be careful because you could be contaminating yourself in your own kitchen. So look at cutting boards, toasters, countertops, utensils, plates, and bowls. I will never forget a story about a woman who was in a restaurant and she had a gluten detection dog, and the gluten detection dog kept alerting for gluten, and they were trying to narrow it down, and it ended up being the fork. The fork that was on her plate had gluten on it, had not been cleaned properly. And honestly, I can't tell you how many times in my life I've been in a restaurant and the silverware is not entirely clean, and it can be the same thing for the plate or the bowl. And it can be the same thing in your house. It happens, right? Mistakes happen. So those are things to pay attention to. And I had suspected that myself already, because a lot of times there'd be a place I could go, and if I got the food to go, I was fine. But if I ate it there on their dishes, I would have symptoms of being glutened. So that can be an issue. And sometimes if you're eating somewhere, you can ask, can you put in a to go? This comes later after you've gotten the hang of things. I'm jumping ahead. Don't, right now, honestly, don't eat out. Give yourself a break. So, because it's very unlikely you will get safe food eating out. It's very, very hard. So just don't keep bringing all that gluten in right now. Let your body heal right now and don't eat out. There is also, food you're buying is been on equipment, like I said, to process it, to package it. I will never forget one time I was buying beans, and beans are naturally gluten-free, so I wasn't really reading labels. And there were beans, they're usually in bags. There were these beans that were in a box. I believe the brand was Eden. And they were in a box. And I just thought how this would fit so much neater in my cabinet at home than bags, trying to, stack bags and stuff. So I bought the one in the box. And I got so sick. And then I read the label and it said that it was packaged on equipment shared with wheat. So to put it into the box, it was on some sort of equipment that was also being shared with wheat. So it is important to read those labels and to be careful, because even something that you think there's no way this has gluten, it can be contaminated. So also, think about your hands, or if you're wearing gloves, and not just yourself. If someone else is preparing your food for you, they need to be clean. They can be touching something with gluten and then touching your food, and that's going to cross-contaminate. I have heard so many stories about, usually in restaurants, but it can happen in someone's kitchen too, about cooking pasta, where if you order gluten-free pasta, it gets cooked in the same pot where they're cooking the gluten pasta, and that's absolutely cross-contaminated. That is not safe. So that could even happen in a house. Even early on, eating at other people's houses, they'd say, like, do you want a salad? And I'd be like, yeah, how could salad's gluten-free? And then I would see them pulling out, they store their lettuce in a bag that they bought a loaf of bread in, that they're now using to store their lettuce. And I was like, okay, no, like, no salad for me. So the things people do in their own houses, like, you really need to be aware if you're going to eat at someone's house. I very early on just stopped eating at everyone's house, because even if I said, like, okay, I trust this person, but not that person, other people were watching and they were very offended that I wouldn't eat at their house, but I was eating at this person's house. So for me, it depends on your situation. For me, just very quickly, people were glutening me, and I just had to cut it off and say, I can't eat at anyone's house. And restaurants were very, very slim picking. They still are. We hardly ever eat out, but that was how I had to handle it. Also consider airborne. If you're going somewhere where someone has been baking, this is for me, most problematic around the holidays. If there has been flour, and it can be airborne for a couple of days, there can still be particles in the air that you can inhale. And I have gotten sick from this exact situation. So also consider, pizzerias. They're typically making the dough. They have flour. It's in the air. I know years ago we were invited to a birthday party at Chuck E. Cheese, and my son and I, we went, and I watched my son like a hawk. Don't put your fingers in your mouth. He was really little, because you're touching. It's like so many gluten foods are held in the hand. Sandwiches, pizza, bagels, like just burgers and hot dogs. They're all in the hand, and then people don't usually wash their hands after they eat, and they're touching everything. And then you have little kids, and it's like, ah. So that was just not an acceptable thing for us. We were invited back for another birthday party at some point, and we just had to say no. We tried it, we gave it our best shot, and it didn't work. But those are things to be aware of. Flour possibly in the air being a problem, and knowing what places and what times of the year, that can be a bigger issue. Be aware of toasters. You cannot use the same toaster that has been toasting things that contain gluten. And look at anything with crevices, anything with scratches, or just not a really smooth surface can be harboring little crumbs of gluten. So just always check things like that. A lot of people will just say, immediately replace your toaster, replace your cutting boards. Wooden utensils, like your wooden spoons and stuff, they're kind of porous. So anything porous, be very cautious. Those are the kind of things just across the board you should just replace. Or if you're in a house where there's people eating gluten, that's a little harder. Some people do it. Then you want to buy your own stuff and keep it separate and marked as this is gluten-free stuff. And my final point on cross-contamination is always remember that just because you're not having symptoms doesn't mean you're not damaging your small intestine. Some people go by that, they go by the symptoms. And some people have silent celiac where there's no symptoms. That's really, really hard. But then there are people who, especially after the initial, where they kind of start healing, they don't really show much symptoms anymore, or maybe they never did. That's very individual, and it's not something you can rely on to tell you if you're okay or not. Just because you're not having symptoms, if you're eating something risky, you just really need to prioritize your health and take care of yourself and not eat the things that are risky. And then anytime you have cross-contamination accidents, just don't beat yourself up. Just learn from it. Learn from it. That was always my thing. It was like, where did it come from? I would always work on narrowing it down, figuring out where I got gluten from, and then how to avoid that same kind of mistake in the future. I remember, I think the first one that I was really aware of, my son and I were both getting really, really sick, and it was like repeatedly. And I narrowed it down to the almonds. I was making our own almond butter in my Vitamix, and I always bought our almonds at Costco. And I just kept paying attention to what we were eating and what we weren't eating and trying to narrow it down. And it ended up narrowing it down to the we were having almond butter on rice cakes. I narrowed it down to that, and it wasn't the rice cakes. I looked at the almonds, looked at the label, and it said on equipment shared with wheat. And I did not know cross-contamination was a thing, and I really didn't think that it doesn't have wheat in it. It's just on equipment shared with wheat. But it was so bad. I was so sick. My son was sick, and I think it took us like 6 weeks to recover from that, because it happened a couple of days like in a row before I was able to narrow down what it was and remove it. And so it was from that point where I started learning about cross-contamination and reading more labels and trying to make sure nothing on shared equipment. That's still kind of a rule for me. Even if something is certified gluten-free, if it's on shared equipment, it's very risky. And a lot of times I will have symptoms, so I just don't. And so then I wanted to talk about when you do get gluten, how you deal with that. You need to be patient with yourself. You need to let yourself rest. You need to stay hydrated. The symptoms can vary from person to person. For me, I will get a migraine within 20 to 30 minutes of ingesting. I know I know that I've ingested. So I'm usually, if I'm out of my house, like I'm usually still there at the place, and I have to like excuse myself and go home. And then, there's nausea, there's pain. For me, one of the most painful things is like I have like intestinal spasms. And so what I have learned to do is, as soon as I know, I take activated charcoal, like a lot of activated charcoal. Just if you try it, just don't take it near any medications or supplements. It's like a sponge. And so, yeah, it's going to help soak up some of that gluten, and it soaks stuff up, but it will also soak up your medication and your supplements. So just be cautious with that. It kind of gets a bad rap. A lot of people criticize it and say it's not safe because of that. Just as long as you use it properly, you should be fine. I've never had an issue as long as I just don't take it near those things. As soon as I realize I've been glutened, I take several, like, I don't know, 4, 6 capsules of it. And then if I'm having the spasms, as time has passed, I don't have the spasms as bad, but I also don't really get gluten much anymore. It's pretty rare. As I have definitely learned and been able to prevent those things as time has gone on. But one thing that was helpful to me early on with those spasms was cardamom essential oil. And I would put it in a roller bottle and roll it over my intestines. And it really helps with spasms in general. So it did help me with those intestinal spasms, because that was really, really painful for me. But yes, in addition to those things, make sure you rest, make sure you hydrate, consider taking electrolytes. That does help some people. Just make sure they are gluten-free electrolytes. And like I said before, just learn from it. Learn, if as best you can. There are going to be times where you can't narrow it down and figure it out. I always used my NEMA sensor, and now I use my gluten detection dog to really narrow those things down. Mostly, and with the dog, it's a lot easier to just prevent it in the first place. But I always hunted down, tried to figure out where the gluten came from, and then learned from it. Was it something cross-contaminated? Was it just a product that I just shouldn't trust ever? Just learn and figure out what it is and how to not do it again. So I hope this was helpful. I will add, if you are here for yourself, that's usually the easiest thing to manage because you're feeling it firsthand. If you're here because a loved one of yours has been diagnosed with celiac, it's a little bit harder. Just trust them. They don't want to be a pain. They feel like a pain. They feel like they're a problem for you. Make sure you don't contribute to that. Make sure you reassure them that they're not, and just trust them and listen to them. Don't doubt them. Don't tell them like, no, that's ridiculous, and argue. Even if it is, maybe they're wrong. There are moments going through this where you get a little paranoid and you get scared and you get angry and you have all these emotions. Allow them to process those things in a healthy way. And finally, if it's your child or another child in your life, that is the hardest, in my opinion, to manage, because children just socialize and behave so much differently, mostly because they're very touchy and they're all touching the same objects, and then fingers are in the mouth. It's really, really challenging. Just all I can say is hang in there, do your best, educate the child as much as you can, because the more they can control themselves in the situation, the better. It is hard. There will be moments where they just lose all self-control and they're having fun with their friends and they're not thinking. That's going to happen. Just do the best you can. In schools, in public schools, I hear so much where kids are just constantly being glutened. Even if it's not food, it's, in the classroom, there's Play-Doh or there's glue or there's, things that just have gluten in them. That's really, really hard. Or there's birthday parties like constantly happening. It's really hard. I am very thankful that I've always been able to homeschool my son. So we have not had to deal with that. We did deal with a lot of things at our church with kids stuff happening there. But that was like more of a once a week, twice a week, versus an everyday ongoing thing at a school. That is much harder. So just hang in there, do the best you can. Have grace with yourself. Forgive yourself. And at the end of the day, just learn from it and do better. I hope this was helpful. Please consider hitting the thumbs up and subscribing to my channel. My current goal is to hit 300 subscribers. So I hope you would consider subscribing and supporting my channel. Have a great day and God bless you.